There Follows the Dark, Chapter 11. A rogue winter storm moved across the unbroken canopy of the elderwood with unnatural purpose, rolling across the stout branches and dark leaves of the ancient forest as they sought their target. Ice and rime coated the autumn foliage where the storm passed, only for the unseasonable chill to be shed away like water from waxen leaves a moment later. Ash of the jet ibex rode the storm winds of her witchcraft, searching through tendrils of seeking snow for her elusive quarry. She was down there somewhere, but she never stayed in any one place for long. Still, one could not hide from winter itself, and after close to an hour's searching, a flicker of white passed her vision across the darkened forest floor. "There you are." The winds hissed the words as Ash descended through the canopy like an arrow from a taut bowstring. She struck the ground with thunderous force, shaking the boughs of the trees around her. She manifested from the ice and snow and stood, hooded and crowned, surrounded by majestic arboreal titans. This was one of the oldest places in the forest, excepting the heart of the forest itself. Here the trees had never known the bite of iron, and had been left to grow unimpeded through countless centuries, counting up to millennia. The Stag's Run. Ash scanned the area. She'd seen the movement of her target mere moments ago, less than a handful of heartbeats, but this stretch of the forest was hers, and she could move through it with an ease that was unearthly, even by Coven standards. "Stag," Ash called out, "I seek an audience, and would be most grateful for thy indulgence." Biting her lip, Ash waited. The ivory stag was among the eldest of the Coven witches. Not even Ash knew how old she truly was. Legends put her as a contemporary to LeBlanc of the Black Crane, but there was no way to know for certain. The sound of delicate hoofbeats echoed around Ash, who turned on her heel, searching for the source. There was nothing behind her, but the sounds continued to echo, first to her left, then her right, then nearby, then distant, only to close in again a moment later. Kneeling, Ash brushed a hand over the soft moss at her feet and scowled. "I don't have time for games," she muttered, as she eyed the hoofprint that had been pressed into the ground before raising her head. "I'm here for—" The echoing hoofbeats grew deafening as a stampede for the briefest moment before stopping just behind her, and Ash went rigid. Swallowing thickly, Ash stood, then slowly turned on the spot, and her breath caught in her chest as it always did when Ash saw her. Lysandra of the Ivory Stag towered before her, her fair face half shrouded by a crown whose tip descended over her eyes and the bridge of her nose, and rose up and flared out in the image of a mighty rack of antlers. Bright hair the color of sunlight on ice fell in a graceful waterfall down her back over a gown of white. At her feet, the loam of the elderwood churned as roots cradled her. "Good evening, little sister," Lysandra crooned. She reclined back. Roots rose soundlessly from the earth to form something between a throne and a shalong as she relaxed. "Good evening, honored sister," Ash muttered as she lowered her head, then knelt. She had told Lux that equals did not kneel, but the Ivory Stag was a truly singular being. Not kneeling to her would be like not kneeling to the Queen of the Coven. "Can I safely assume the word is given?" Lysandra asked. "Winter approaches quickly, and mortals will want the flesh of the forest soon to ward away its chill." Ash nodded. "The rook refuses her oath, but another has accepted the burden in that one's stead." Out of the corner of her eye, Ash saw Lysandra cock her head curiously, and her full mouth curved into a faint smile. "Is that so?" She held out a hand and gestured for Ash to approach. "Come here and tell me, little sister. Tell me of the rook and the heron." For the second time, Ash's breath caught. It shouldn't have caught her by surprise that Lysandra knew of Lux's selection, but it did. It was said that the half-mask of her crown did not blind the stag, but shielded her eyes from even greater visions. Lysandra's foresight was legendary, even outside of the Elderwood, and many were the folk tales that involved heroes and kings seeking parley with the stag to learn of their fates. Rising, Ash moved closer to Lysandra, almost to her feet, and knelt again. I closer," Lysandra said quietly. "Do not make me repeat myself, Ibex." Ash swallowed and nodded. Her heart thundered in her chest as she stood and approached. She set a foot on one of the serpentine roots, which steadied beneath her weight, and slowly scaled the throne of the stag. Even without the throne's height, Lysandra was head and shoulders above Ash, and her hand came to rest with comfortable intimacy on Ash's waist as she pulled Ash into her lap with one hand and drew down her hood with the other. "Now," Lysandra cooed as her hand trailed down through Ash's hair to caress her cheek, "tell me about the rook." Shivering under the touch, Ash let herself relax into the taller woman's arms, and told her of the rook's refusal and the heron's offer. Lysandra's scent filled Ash's nose as she spoke. It was dizzying, like the smell of mountain flowers, rich and heady, and the longer she stayed in Lysandra's arms, the more she felt as if she were in a daze. It was always like this, though. Lysandra had always favored her like this, much in the same way that the harrier favored the jackal, as the rook favored the heron. "Interesting," Lysandra said as Ash finished her tale. "Most interesting." Delicate fingers traced tingling lines up Ash's neck and under her chin, inclining her head gently upward as Lysandra turned to meet the witch's lips with her own. Ash shivered at the contact. Full lips and a mouth that tasted of fresh snow, ice, and flowers filled her senses. Lysandra leaned in, curling around Ash as she dragged the ibex witch closer until Ash's arms were slung around Lysandra's shoulders and hanging on with desperate strength. It had been Lysandra who had found her a century ago, broken and weeping at the base of the great mountain where her people had once made her home. It had been Lysandra who had guided her through her grief as she laid her family and her people to rest in cold graves after the eclipse had slaughtered them for their worship of the Jet Ibex. And it was Lysandra who had stoked her anger against the Witchfinder Knights, giving her purpose and strength enough to fight through her despair. Since then, the Witch of the Ibex had ever stood with the Witch of the Stag in matters of the Coven. Not even the Coven mistress knew the depth of their relationship. In public, they bickered and snapped at one another, with the Ibex serving as the straw woman for the Stag to tear down to give credence to her way of thinking. Ash would gather support to argue against Lysandra, and then quietly topple it from within. Was it honorable? No. But Ash had long since stopped caring for such things. Once upon a time, Ash had been the queen of a vibrant people. Now she was queen of 2,000 graves, buried under meters of snow, in a city so utterly destroyed that it existed now solely in her memories. Rulership had soured for her, and left Ash content to serve as Lysandra's right hand, to share her victories as well as her bed, even if only in secret. Lysandra pulled away with a Cheshire grin as Ash took in heavy draws of air and licked her lips. "Tell me, little sister, do you think the heron shall succeed?" Lysandra whispered as she dragged her fingernails softly down Ash's pale neck to her shoulders, pushing her mantle and gown away and baring her shoulder. "My vision is nothing to yours, honored sister," Ash breathed. "And yet, my vision is blinded by the light of the sun," Lysandra replied playfully, then lolled out her tongue and trailed it up the pale column of Ash's neck. Ash shivered. It's very difficult to concentrate on your questions when you're doing that." A sultry laugh bubbled up from Lysandra's chest. "I know," she purred. "Isn't that half the fun?" Lysandra took a firm grip on a handful of gown and dragged it roughly down as she pressed her lips to the rolling muscle of Ash's powerful shoulders. Her hands roved along the now bare skin of Ash's torso, along her abdomen and higher. "Now, tell me," Lysandra's mouth moved pleasingly against Ash's skin. "Tell me your thoughts until there are no more thoughts in that lovely head of yours." She dug her teeth into the pale flesh, just enough to mark it, and Ash gasped and moved up to whisper into her ear. "Speak until there are no thoughts left but those of me." Ash bit her lip and began to talk. The tree at the center of the Morn Grove was uncharacteristically quiet given the home's owner and her proclivity for magical experimentation. Unable to find rest, Lux had returned to the den of the tree, made herself some lemon tea, and resolved to wait out Jinx's tantrum, or whatever it truly was, at the table they shared their meals at. 3 cups of tea later, in the wee hours of the morning, Lux was starting to genuinely worry that Jinx might not be back today, or even later that evening. Once again, she found herself bitter about the fact that she didn't know Jinx nearly as well as she felt like she did. It was as though her heart had turned traitor in her breast sometime between arriving at the forest and looking Jinx in the eye for the first time. Nevertheless, she waited. She would wait here all week if she had to, barring the call to arms from Ash. If she failed at that, then the price might still come down on Jinx. She had no idea how witch oaths worked, really, beyond the general folklore. That was a whole other problem she had to agonize over. Lux had, now that she had time to think of it, perhaps a bit rashly overcommitted herself. Magic came easier to her, but that didn't make her a sorceress of any stripe. In truth, she was probably little more than a talented hedge witch with a shiny crown and a bit of extra oomph from the Dawn Heron whom, Lux reflected with an icy drop in her gut, she also knew precious little about. The cosmology of witches didn't tend to feature heavily in classical education, unsurprisingly. Lux lifted her 4th cup of tea, which was down to the dregs, and sipped down the last of it. Her eyes ached with exhaustion. She wanted to sleep, but she knew that the moment she laid on the mattress in her room, her mind would begin to race, filled with visions of black pinned blue eyes and 2 wide smiles. "This is foolish," Lux muttered as she blinked the weariness from her eyes and stood up, letting her teacup fall from her hands with a clatter. "I'm done waiting." This was the Elderwood, and she wasn't without allies. Lux herself might be lacking in any useful magic for tracking down Jinx, but that didn't mean her sisters didn't possess some talents she could perhaps bargain the use of. Zyra seemed like a good place to start. She was black-eyed, like Jinx, and probably powerful, and the little she'd seen of the strange woman suggested that she was deeply connected to the forest. If anyone could tap into the Elderwood to find Jinx, it would be her. With her plan in mind, Lux took a bracing breath, pulled on her boots, slung her cloak over her new robes, and went to the door. For a moment, she hesitated. What if Jinx came back while she was gone? What if she thought that Lux had left her? She could leave behind a note, but would Jinx even find it? More importantly, would she even notice? Lux pressed her lips to a thin line and shook her head. Worst case scenario, Zyra told her she couldn't help, and if that was the case, then Lux resolved to come back and wait till morning. Besides, maybe Jinx deserved a little worry. She'd certainly given Lux more than her fair share of it tonight. "You're an absolute louse, Jinx," Lux muttered as she pushed the door open. Thud. Ow. Lux blinked in confusion as the door stopped on something, and she craned her head out and looked down, searching for the source of the infuriatingly familiar voice that rose up from around shin level. "Jinx?" Lux stared in disbelief at the lanky witch who was curled up on the doorstep of her own house to go to sleep. The same witch who was sitting up groggily as Lux worked her jaw open and closed, caught between relief and incandescent fury, as Jinx rubbed the side of her head where the door had collided with one hand while covering a yawn with the other. "What are you doing there?" Lux cried as she pushed the door the rest of the way open. "How long have you been Have you got any idea how worried No. Lux shook her head as she reached down and grabbed Jinx by the collar and dragged her up to her feet, eliciting a yelp from the taller witch. "First of all, how dare you just run out on me like that?" For the first time since she'd met Jinx, Lux saw the woman flinch. Her wide smile was glassy and fragile, clinging to her face by what seemed like cobwebs, and her eyes were still wide, but they were darting around rather than hyper-focused like usual. It was as though she was trying to look anywhere but at Lux, which was difficult since Lux had brought their faces mere inches apart. Jinx made no attempt to respond or defend herself. She stood limply, like a rag doll held up by the most threadbare strings, and pitched tears slid without end down her cheeks, drawing a black line down the center of each one. "You scared me, Jinx. You ran away from me and you left me alone. Lux sobbed, not letting go of Jinx's collar for fear that she'd just explode away again like before. Lux bristled as Jinx turned her head away completely, her smile thinned to a grim slice that divided her face nearly in half, and Lux was about to let loose another furious tirade when she realized something that made the words stick in her throat. Jinx was shaking. Not just trembling or cold, she was practically vibrating. Her eyes were so much wider than normal, and her smile had never looked more anemic. And it took Lux staring at her blankly for almost half a minute for her to realize what the near-alien expression was. Jinx was actually afraid. Swallowing hard, Lux forced her white-knuckled hands to relax. Jinx stumbled back a few steps, and her throat bobbed as she wrapped her arms around herself. She kept her gaze pinned firmly down and to the right, anchored on the ground rather than anywhere that Lux might be. Lux took a deep breath and tried to calm down. Her temper wasn't one of her best qualities, and it was something that had plagued her since she was young. Anger had its uses, and it had certainly kept her alive through her year and a half of flight from the eclipse, but it would do her no good here. Jinx, Lux said more calmly. I need you to talk to me, okay? Jinx swallowed visibly and gave a shaky nod of her head. It took a few tries for her to unglue her mouth, and a few more to get any sound out beyond a dull croak, but eventually Jinx managed to lick her lips, take in more than just a gulp of air as a breath, and speak. Please don't leave. 3 words were all it took to break Lux's heart. It wasn't just the words, it was the desperate and terrified tone they were spoken in. It was the way the words sounded cracked and brittle with tears, and how they sounded almost squeezed out past a throat that was thick with panic. Lux blinked rapidly and took a few breaths of her own before stepping forward and reaching out to put her hands on Jinx's cheeks. She didn't force Jinx to move. She just rested her hands on skin that was chilly to the touch and said, "Look at me, Jinx." With glacial slowness, Jinx turned her head until her black-pinned eyes met Lux's clear blue ones. A small swipe of her thumbs wiped away the black tears, leaving faint stains where they touched. Lux stared into Jinx's eyes as new droplets of pitch rolled down her cheeks. She could feel Jinx shaking. She could feel every trembling breath that rattled through her chest and every tense grind of her jaw. "Never," Lux said softly as she pulled Jinx a little closer. "Do you hear me?" she asked quietly. "I'm never going to leave you, okay?" Jinx swallowed again and started to turn her head again, but Lux held on. "Don't do that," Lux said firmly. "Stop running from me, please." "You're too bright, Blondie. I can't." Jinx bit her lip and forced herself to look back at Lux. "I won't leave you, Jinx," Lux repeated. "But I need to know that you're not going to leave me behind either, okay? That you're not just going to run away from me every time we get into an argument." Pitch continued to flow down Jinx's cheeks as she took a few more shaky breaths, then nodded before lowering her head and pressing her forehead against Lux's. "I'm sorry. I know. I didn't mean to get mad, Blondie." "I know." One of the strangest and most charming things about Jinx, at least to Lux, was that no matter what Jinx was saying or doing, she never seemed to stop smiling. Lux would say seem only because sometimes it wasn't a smile in the traditional sense. Seeing her like this, Lux finally understood what the others had meant about Jinx smiling in a way that wasn't real, even if she wasn't sure she agreed with that assessment. It wasn't that Jinx's smile wasn't real. It was just that all of Jinx's expressions were smiles. Sad smiles, angry smiles, happy smiles, content smiles. They were all real expressions. They were just different. Real, but different. Like Jinx. "Do you promise not to run away from me anymore?" Lux asked, and Jinx nodded miserably. "Good." Lux leaned up and kissed her cheek. "Then I forgive you." Another nod. Lux reached down and took Jinx's hand, twining her fingers comfortably with Jinx's, and stepped back to tow Jinx into the house. She moved sluggishly, her brittle, miserable smile still in place as Lux pulled her through the den. She pushed open the door to Jinx's room and had to maneuver a bit to get around the mess on the floor without trotting on anything important, but eventually got Jinx to her bed. "You're freezing," Lux said softly as she knelt and ran her hand up across Jinx's forearm and up to her shoulder. "How long were you out there?" Jinx shrugged. "Why were you sleeping out there?" Jinx wiped away another stream of tears from her cheeks and shrugged again. Lux shook her head and let out a small sigh. Jinx was not the easiest person to communicate with. Lux could understand why the others found her troublesome, but she wasn't going to give up on her. Lux had the distinct feeling that enough people in Jinx's life had already done that. Is it because you thought I was mad at you?" Lux asked, and Jinx stiffened. "Bullseye." Lux sighed again. "Well, you were right," Lux said. Jinx flinched, but Lux didn't let her start spiraling. "I was mad because you scared me and then ran away without a word, so yes, Jinx, I was angry." Jinx started to look away again, but Lux caught her and drew her back to face her. "But that's not the end of the world, okay?" Lux continued. "I'll get over it so long as you just come back and talk to me." She reached up and brushed a few pale strands out of Jinx's eyes as she gave a final tiny nod of acquiescence. Satisfied that they, at least to some extent, understood each other, Lux moved to Jinx's side, sat down on the bed, and leaned in close, laying her head on Jinx's shoulder and curling up against her. Jinx wrapped her arm around her and laid her head against Lux's, and for a moment they just sat in silence, content that whatever storm had risen up between them had, for the most part, passed. "You can't go east, though, Blondie," Jinx finally said. "I promised, and I can't and won't take back my first oath," Lux replied. Now it was Jinx's turn to sigh. "There's gonna be nights," Jinx said. "Eclipse nights, nasty ones." Lux shifted slightly to look up at Jinx, who had started to idly trace those long fingers of hers up and down Lux's arm. This sort of quiet, comfortable intimacy had snuck up on Lux, but she couldn't say she didn't enjoy it. "I'm a witch of the Elderwood now, Jinx, and defending the forest isn't something I can just give up on," Lux said as she leaned in closer. "Besides, I'm tired of running away from the people who burned my home to ashes and chased me across half a continent." She grit her teeth as a shiver ran up her. "I want to fight back." "Fight back, huh?" Jinx repeated quietly as she looked down and met Lux's eyes. "How many spells you know, Blondie?" Lux grimaced and looked away. "Just the binding spell and a basic shield," she admitted. "Yeah, they're gonna turn you inside out if that's all you got," Jinx said flatly. "Well, it's not as though Demacia has an academy of witchcraft," Lux huffed. "I'm not a century and a half old like the rest of you." "I'm only 23, Jinx said. Lux sat up sharply and stared at Jinx. 23? She was barely older than Lux herself, and yet she compared easily to any of the elder witches in the forest. "How?" Lux breathed. "How are you so powerful if you're that young?" The shrug seemed to be Jinx's communication method of choice. "I don't know how to explain it, Blondie," Jinx replied. She held out a hand and flicked her fingers, and arcs of blue lightning danced between them. "Listen for it." Lux sat up and looked at Jinx curiously. "Can you teach me to listen too?" Lux asked. Surprise crossed Jinx's face, then confusion, which morphed slowly into consideration as she rocked back and forth on the bed, and then slowly her smile began to grow as she looked back at Lux. "I can try," Jinx said,